He came home early, keys shaking in his hand, heart light with the thought of surprising his family. But the moment he opened the door, the silence felt wrong. Then he saw it. One moment, one scene, and in that instant, his entire life shattered in a way he was never meant to witness. Daniel had never come home this early before. Years of overtime, long commutes, and exhaustion had shaped his routine into something predictable. But that afternoon, the meeting was canceled, and something inside him whispered to go home. He imagined his wife, Elena, smiling in surprise. He pictured his daughter, Lily, running into his arms. That thought carried him up the driveway, his steps lighter than usual. The house was quiet when he entered. Too quiet. No television, no music, no familiar sounds of movement. The air felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. Daniel called out softly, "Elena?" No answer. He took off his shoes slowly, his excitement dissolving into unease. As he moved deeper into the house, he noticed Lily's backpack abandoned near the couch. His heart skipped. She was always careful with her things. Then he heard it, a faint sound from the bedroom. Not voices, not crying, just a silence that pressed against his chest. He stood outside the door, hand hovering over the handle. A strange dread crawled up his spine, warning him to turn away. But curiosity and love pushed him forward. He opened the door, and what he saw froze him in place. His breath caught, his vision blurred, and in that moment, Daniel understood how quickly a life could fracture. Some truths arrive without warning, and once seen, they can never be unseen. Elena was sitting on the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumped, her face pale and streaked with tears. Across from her stood a man Daniel recognized instantly. Mark, his younger brother. The room felt unbearably small, the air suffocating. Time slowed as Daniel tried to make sense of the image burned into his eyes. No one spoke. No one moved. Elena's eyes widened in horror when she saw him. Mark turned slowly, guilt written across his face like a confession he never intended to give. Daniel felt something crack inside his chest, sharp and irreversible. "Daniel," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. He couldn't answer. Words failed him. His mind raced through years of memories, shared dinners, laughter, sacrifices made for family. He had trusted them both with his heart, and now that trust lay shattered at his feet. Mark took a step forward. "It's not what it looks like." "Stop," Daniel said finally, his voice low, broken. One word carried all his pain, disbelief, and rage. He backed away slowly, as if the room itself were collapsing. He didn't want explanations. He didn't want excuses. He wanted to wake up from what felt like a cruel illusion. Without another word, Daniel turned and walked out. He didn't slam the door. He didn't shout. His silence was louder than any scream, carrying the weight of betrayal that would haunt every step he took from that house. Daniel sat in his car for hours, staring through the windshield as daylight faded into darkness. The steering wheel felt cold beneath his hands, grounding him in a reality he didn't want to accept. His phone buzzed repeatedly, calls from Elena, messages he couldn't bring himself to read. He replayed every memory, searching for signs he had missed. The late nights, the distant smiles, the moments he had chosen work over presence. Guilt crept in, uninvited but persistent. Had he failed her? Had he failed his family? Tears streamed down his face, unchecked. He had always believed love was built on loyalty and sacrifice. He had given everything he had, time, energy, dreams, to keep his family safe. And now, that foundation felt like sand slipping through his fingers. The thought of Lily pierced him the deepest. How would this change her world? How would he explain pain he barely understood himself? The idea of her innocence being touched by this betrayal broke him further. Daniel rested his forehead against the steering wheel, whispering a quiet prayer for strength. Not revenge, not answers, just strength to survive the night. Sometimes heartbreak isn't loud. Sometimes it sits with you in silence, heavy and unrelenting, asking you to decide who you will become after everything you believed in falls apart. When Daniel finally returned home, the house felt unfamiliar, like a place he no longer belonged. Elena was sitting at the kitchen table, eyes red, hands clenched together. She looked up as he entered, hope and fear colliding in her expression. "I never meant to hurt you," she said quietly. Daniel listened, numb, as she spoke of loneliness, of feeling invisible, of moments of weakness that spiraled into something unforgivable. Each word landed like a slow, aching blow. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but exhaustion weighed him down. "I worked so hard for us," he replied softly. "I thought love meant sacrifice." She nodded, tears falling freely. "It does, and I forgot that." Silence filled the space between them, thick with regret. Neither knew what forgiveness would look like, if it was even possible. Love, Daniel realized, was fragile. It demanded attention, presence, and honesty. Neglect didn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it came from distraction. That night, Daniel slept on the couch, staring at the ceiling, questioning everything he thought he knew about marriage, trust, and himself. He wasn't ready to forgive. He wasn't ready to leave. He was suspended between pain and hope, unsure which would claim him first. The next morning, Lily stood in the doorway, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Daddy, are you mad at Mommy?" Daniel's heart broke all over again. He knelt beside her, pulling her into his arms, breathing in the familiar comfort of her presence. "No, sweetheart," he whispered. "Daddy's just tired." In that moment, he understood what was truly at stake. Not pride, not anger, but the fragile heart of a child who believed her parents were her entire world. Later that day, Daniel visited his brother. Mark couldn't meet his eyes. Apologies poured out, heavy with shame. Daniel listened, his pain steady but controlled. "You didn't just betray me," he said quietly. "You betrayed the family we were raised to protect." Walking away, Daniel felt lighter, not healed, but clearer. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about excusing the pain. It was about choosing what deserved to survive beyond it. That evening, he returned home with a decision forming in his heart. Whatever came next, it would be guided by compassion, responsibility, and love, not resentment. Because sometimes, coming home early doesn't just reveal a secret. It reveals who we are when everything we love is tested. The days that followed moved slowly, as if time itself was unsure how to proceed. Daniel stayed, not because the pain had softened, but because walking away felt like abandoning more than just a marriage. Elena tried to give him space, speaking only when necessary, her guilt heavy in every glance. The house became a place of quiet coexistence, where love and heartbreak shared the same walls. At night, Daniel lay awake, staring into darkness, replaying moments he once cherished. He realized how often he had mistaken providing for loving. He had been present in duty, but absent in spirit. That truth didn't excuse betrayal, but it forced him to confront his own shortcomings. Regret wrapped itself around him, not as punishment, but as reflection. Lily sensed the shift. She clung to Daniel more, asked fewer questions, and watched her parents with careful eyes. Children, he learned, felt fractures long before words explained them. One evening, she placed a crayon drawing on his lap. It showed the three of them holding hands, smiling beneath a bright sun. "Can we be like this again?" she asked softly. Daniel swallowed hard. He hugged her tightly, realizing that healing wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about responsibility. To her, to the life they had built, to the man he still wanted to be. That night, he decided not to rush any answers. Some wounds required patience before they could even begin to close. Elena finally spoke one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, "but I need you to know I'm willing to do the work, even if it takes years." Daniel studied her face, the familiar lines, the exhaustion, the regret etched deep. This wasn't the woman who had betrayed him in a moment of weakness. This was someone carrying the weight of her choices every second. Pain didn't erase love instantly. It complicated it. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he replied honestly, "but I don't want to become bitter either." They agreed to counseling, not as a promise of reconciliation, but as an attempt to understand what had broken them. Each session peeled back layers of silence, unmet needs, and emotional distance. It was uncomfortable, raw, necessary. Daniel learned that strength wasn't always about endurance. Sometimes it meant vulnerability. He admitted how lonely he had felt carrying the pressure of being the provider. Elena admitted how invisible she had felt standing beside him. There were no miracles, no dramatic transformations, just slow, painful honesty. Some nights ended in tears, others in silence. But occasionally, there were moments of shared laughter, small, unexpected reminders of what had once brought them together. Healing, Daniel realized, wasn't a straight path. It was uneven, fragile, and frightening. But for the first time since that afternoon, it felt possible. One afternoon, Daniel took Lily to the park, watching her run freely, unaware of the emotional storms swirling around her world. Parents sat nearby, scrolling on phones, laughing, arguing, life continuing as usual. He wondered how many of them carried hidden fractures behind familiar smiles. Lily climbed onto his lap, her arms wrapping around his neck. "I like when you're home more," she said innocently. The words pierced him. He realized that coming home early that day hadn't just exposed betrayal. It had exposed absence. He promised himself silently that no matter what happened between him and Elena, he would never again be distant from his daughter. That evening, Daniel declined extra work for the first time in years. He cooked dinner. He listened. He stayed present. Elena noticed but said nothing, her gratitude quiet and cautious. Later, Daniel sat alone on the porch, reflecting on how easily life drifted off course. No one planned to fail the people they loved. It happened in small neglects, unspoken feelings, and moments left unattended. Forgiveness still felt distant, but understanding was growing. And sometimes, understanding was the first step toward mercy. Not just for others, but for oneself. Daniel wasn't ready to forget what he had seen, but he was learning how to live with it without letting it destroy everything else that mattered. Mark reached out again, this time with no excuses, no explanations, just accountability. Daniel met him reluctantly at a quiet cafe. His brother looked older somehow, weighed down by shame. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Mark said. "I just needed you to know I'll carry this for the rest of my life." Daniel listened, anger flickering, but no longer consuming him. "You broke something sacred," he replied, "and some things never fully heal." Mark nodded. "I know." Walking away, Daniel felt a strange release. Forgiveness, he realized, didn't require reconciliation. Sometimes, it simply meant letting go of the desire to punish. Back home, Elena noticed a subtle shift in him. He was calmer, more grounded. Pain still lingered, but it no longer controlled his every thought. They spoke more openly now, even when conversations were difficult. One night, Elena said, "Thank you for staying." Daniel answered honestly, "I didn't stay because it was easy. I stayed because walking away wouldn't teach Lily how to face broken things." That realization settled deeply within him. Love wasn't proven only in happiness, but in how people responded to failure. And in that understanding, Daniel began to redefine what strength truly meant. Weeks passed, and while scars remained, something fragile but genuine began to form. Trust rebuilt slowly, cautiously, brick by brick. Daniel didn't rush forgiveness. Elena didn't demand it. They let time do what force never could. One evening, they sat together watching Lily sleep, her chest rising and falling peacefully. Elena whispered, "I almost destroyed everything." Daniel nodded, "And I almost lost sight of what mattered." They weren't the same people they had been before that day. And maybe that was the point. Pain had reshaped them, stripped illusions, and revealed truths they could no longer ignore. Daniel understood now that coming home early hadn't been an accident. It was a turning point, a painful gift, one that forced honesty where comfort had once lived. Love, he learned, wasn't guaranteed by vows. It was sustained by attention, humility, and courage. And while betrayal changed everything, it didn't have to define the ending. As he turned off the light, Daniel felt something unfamiliar, yet welcome, hope. Not naive, not blind, but earned. Some truths hurt because they demand growth. And sometimes, what we were never meant to see becomes exactly what we need to become better than we were before. Counseling forced Daniel to confront a truth he had avoided for years. Love neglected slowly bleeds out, even when no one notices. Sitting across from Elena in a quiet room, he listened as she spoke about loneliness, not the absence of people, but the absence of connection. Her words hurt, not because they excused betrayal, but because they were painfully honest. Daniel admitted how pressure had consumed him. He had measured success in bills paid and hours worked, believing sacrifice alone was love. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing Elena as a partner and started seeing her as someone who would always be there, no matter how distant he became. That realization didn't absolve her choices, but shattered the illusion that he had been blameless. Outside the office, Daniel sat alone in his car, hands trembling slightly. Ralph, he realized, was uncomfortable. It required acknowledging where you failed without drowning in guilt. He thought of Lily, how easily children absorb lessons not from words, but from behavior. He didn't want her to grow up believing love meant silence, avoidance, or emotional absence. That night, Daniel apologized, not for what Elena had done, but for what he hadn't. The words felt heavy yet freeing. Elena cried quietly, not in relief, but in understanding. It was the first time in weeks that pain didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a doorway. Elena began rebuilding trust, not with promises, but with consistency. She shared her days openly, invited questions, accepted boundaries without complaint. Daniel noticed how humility softened her presence, how accountability replaced defensiveness. Healing, he learned, was built in ordinary moments, not grand gestures. One evening, Elena handed Daniel her phone without being asked. "You don't need to check," she said. "I just want you to know there are no secrets anymore." Daniel didn't take it. Trust, he realized, wasn't enforced, it was earned. And strangely, that moment mattered more than proof ever could. They started taking walks together after dinner, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about everything except the pain. Laughter returned cautiously, like a visitor unsure if it was welcome. Lily noticed first. She smiled more. She relaxed. She began to believe again. Still, some nights were heavy. Daniel woke from dreams of that afternoon, the image replaying uninvited. Elena would reach for his hand, offering comfort without expectation. That patience mattered. Daniel understood that forgiveness wasn't forgetting. It was choosing to move forward without reopening wounds every day. Slowly, trust stopped feeling impossible. It became fragile but real. And for the first time, Daniel stopped asking why this had happened and started asking who he wanted to become after it. Mark moved away shortly after. He didn't announce it, didn't seek closure. He simply removed himself from their lives, understanding that presence was no longer appropriate. Daniel didn't stop him. Some distances, he realized, were necessary for healing. Months passed. Seasons changed. The house felt warmer again, not perfect, but honest. Daniel adjusted his work schedule, choosing presence over overtime. He attended school events, helped with homework, cooked meals. Love became active instead of assumed. One afternoon, Lily asked, "Are you and Mommy okay now?" Daniel paused. "We're learning," he said gently. That answer mattered. It taught her that love wasn't flawless. It was resilient. Elena watched these moments quietly, gratitude soft in her eyes. She didn't rush milestones or demand reassurance. She allowed Daniel space to heal at his own pace. One night, sitting together on the couch, Daniel finally said the words he had feared and needed equally. "I forgive you." Elena broke down, not from relief, but from the weight of what forgiveness cost. Daniel felt something lift inside him. Forgiveness didn't erase pain, but it freed him from carrying it forever. He understood now. Forgiveness wasn't for the past. It was for the future. And that future, though shaped by scars, no longer felt broken beyond repair. On the anniversary of that day, Daniel came home early again. This time, not by accident, but by choice. The house smelled of dinner. Lily's laughter echoed from the living room. Elena looked up, surprised, and smiled. That smile felt different, earned. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment, absorbing the ordinary beauty of the scene. He realized how close he had come to losing everything, not just because of betrayal, but because of emotional absence. Pain had exposed truth, and truth had demanded change. Later that night, Daniel sat alone, reflecting on how life rarely warns you before testing your values. Strength wasn't avoiding pain. It was deciding how pain would shape you. He no longer defined that day as the moment everything broke. He defined it as the moment everything became real. Trust had returned, not blind, not naive, but intentional. Love had matured. It now carried honesty, humility, and effort. Daniel understood something profound. People don't fail relationships suddenly. They drift, they neglect, they assume. And healing doesn't happen suddenly either. It happens when people choose to stay present, even when it's uncomfortable. That night, Daniel slept peacefully, knowing that while the past couldn't be changed, the future was finally being built with open eyes. Years later, Daniel would still remember that afternoon, the keys shaking in his hand, the silence behind the door, the image he was never meant to see. But it no longer haunted him. It taught him. He and Elena weren't perfect. They still argued. They still struggled. But they faced life together now, with honesty instead of avoidance. Lily grew up watching two people who chose accountability over pride, forgiveness over bitterness. And that lesson stayed with her longer than any spoken advice ever could. Daniel realized that coming home early hadn't ruined his life. It saved it from illusions, from emotional distance, from a version of love that was slowly dying. Some truths hurt because they demand responsibility. Some pain exists to redirect us before it's too late. And sometimes, what we were never meant to see becomes the very thing that teaches us how to love better, deeper, and more intentionally than ever before. Daniel no longer feared unexpected moments. He welcomed them. Because life, he learned, doesn't break us to destroy us. It breaks us to reveal who we are capable of becoming. Life didn't suddenly become gentle after forgiveness. Challenges still arrived unannounced. Financial stress returned. Disagreements surfaced. But now Daniel faced them differently. He no longer escaped into work or silence. He stayed present, even when it was uncomfortable. One evening, Elena admitted she still carried fear. "I'm afraid I'll never fully make up for what I did," she said. Daniel listened carefully. "You don't make up for the past," he replied. "You honor it by not repeating it." Those words surprised even him. They reflected how much he had grown. Pain had reshaped his values, teaching him that love was not proven by perfection, but by consistency. They began small rituals, weekly check-ins, shared meals without phones, honest conversations before resentment could grow. These moments didn't erase history, but they protected the future. Lily noticed too. She saw patience replace tension. She saw apologies spoken freely. She learned that love didn't mean never hurting each other. It meant taking responsibility when you did. Daniel realized that healing wasn't about returning to who they were before. It was about becoming people who deserved a second chance. And every time doubt crept in, he reminded himself, growth born from pain was still growth. and that mattered more than pretending nothing had ever broken point. One quiet afternoon, Daniel found Elena sitting alone, looking through old photographs. Tears rested silently on her cheeks. "I wish I could go back," she said, "and make different choices." Daniel sat beside her. "So do I," he admitted, "but we can't live backward." He pointed to a picture of Lily laughing between them. "This is where we live now." Elena leaned into him, her guilt softened by acceptance. Daniel realized that forgiveness wasn't something you granted once. It was something you practiced daily. Some days it came easily. Other days it required effort. But each time, it loosened the grip of the past. Daniel thought about how many people walked away when things shattered. Sometimes leaving was necessary, but sometimes staying, when done with honesty, was braver. He understood now that love demanded presence even when it hurt, courage even when trust was fragile, and humility even when pride begged for control. That evening, Daniel wrote a letter, not to Elena, not to Mark, but to himself, a reminder of who he had been, who he had become, and who he never wanted to be again. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. Some lessons, he knew, were meant to be remembered, not relived. Years passed quietly. Lily grew taller, wiser, more observant. One day, during a school project about family, she asked Daniel, "Do all families break sometimes?" Daniel smiled gently. "Yes," he said, "but not all of them choose to repair." That answer stayed with her. Daniel and Elena stood stronger, not because their past disappeared, but because they faced it honestly. Trust had been rebuilt through transparency, not fear. Love had matured into something steady and intentional. Occasionally, Daniel still thought about that day, the early arrival, the silence, the door. But it no longer filled him with rage or despair. It filled him with gratitude for the awakening it forced. He understood now that life rarely gives warnings before revealing truths. And sometimes, the most painful revelations arrive disguised as accidents. Daniel no longer feared what he might uncover in life. He trusted himself to face it, with integrity, compassion, and courage. Because healing didn't mean pretending nothing happened. It meant choosing growth over bitterness. And growth, he learned, was the quiet miracle that followed forgiveness. On a calm evening, Daniel and Elena watched the sunset from the porch, hands intertwined. There was peace, not perfect, but real. "If you hadn't come home early that day," Elena said softly, "where do you think we'd be?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "Still together," he replied, but slowly falling apart. The truth settled gently between them. Daniel realized that some moments feel cruel only because they interrupt comfortable illusions. Coming home early hadn't destroyed his life. It had revealed it. He thought of all the people walking through life unaware of the fractures beneath the surface, hoping things would somehow fix themselves. He knew now that love demanded awareness, effort, and presence. Pain had changed him, but not into someone colder. It had made him more attentive, more compassionate, more human. That night, Daniel held Elena a little closer, not out of fear, but gratitude. Some truths arrive uninvited. Some moments rewrite us. And some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Daniel stood in the doorway again one evening, key steady in his hand. The house was alive with sound, laughter, conversation, warmth. He smiled. He had once stood here frozen by a truth he was never meant to see. Now he stood grounded by a life he had chosen to rebuild. Pain had tested him. Love had taught him. Forgiveness had freed him. Daniel understood that life doesn't promise protection from heartbreak, but it offers growth to those willing to face it honestly. He stepped inside, greeted by the people who mattered most, carrying lessons he would never forget. Some truths shatter us, others shape us, and some do both if we let them. Sometimes, what we were never meant to see becomes the moment that saves us. Pain can teach, love can rebuild, and second chances are born when courage replaces bitterness. If this story touched your heart, like, subscribe, and join our Heart Angels family.